Welcome back to 60 Skills, and the topic of today's discussion is what is clairaudience and why develop it? Well, first of all, clairaudience, simply put, is your subtle sense of hearing. Now, as such, this is one of the more important siddhis or special abilities to develop in the yogic process, because developing your clairaudience allows you to hear what the spirit or subtle worlds are saying. Now, in a controlled manner, this is called clairaudience. In an uncontrolled manner, being able to hear the spirit world is otherwise known as schizophrenia. So it's pretty important to approach this from a controlled manner. Now, also keep in mind there are very many different forms of clairaudience. At a minimum, there is vital level clairaudience, which basically deals with the etheric or near physical realm. There are various kinds of astral level clairaudience, which is one step up in the chain of enlightenment. There is mental level clairaudience, and believe it or not, there's even akashic level clairaudience. Now, very few individuals naturally have access to all of these. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. But the training tools for developing all of this are largely similar. So that's the good news. All right. How is it developed? Okay. Well, there are a couple different ways people have access to clairaudience. Some people, those lucky few that all the rest of us hate, are simply born with it. Now, when this is the case, typically they can only key into one or a couple of different levels of reality. Very rarely do they have comprehensive and, most importantly, controlled clairaudience. The next category of clairaudient individuals comes to people who have suffered some kind of trauma, head trauma, or through some kind of drug exposure that's caused brain damage and in turn has damaged that mental astral or astral vital matrix, which then allows for an easier transfer of information. Again, in most cases, this is unfortunately uncontrolled and usually manifests as a mild case of schizophrenia. Not pleasant. Okay, we also have the aspect of training. Now, I'm going to get into a minute what that consists of, but the interesting thing about the trained approach to the subtle senses is if you have an uncontrolled version of one of these skills, clairvoyance and clairaudience being the most common, training it intentionally will generally result in the ability disappearing for a period of time. Essentially, what's happening is whatever's broken in that internal and subtle structure that allows this uncontrolled flow of information gets repaired. Now, the good news is as you continue to train these skills, they will come back in a controlled fashion. And let me be clear about what I mean by a controlled approach. That means you can turn it on and you can turn it off. All right, so next we're going to get into how or the different kinds of trainings that are involved. Okay, one way by which people develop clairaudience, and this is true of clairvoyance as well, is through initiation or transmission from a more powerfully endowed practitioner. Sometimes these are referred to as gurus, masters, you name it. Again, the issue with this is if you receive this via transmission, simply having someone walk in and turn the lights on, so to speak, it tends to be difficult to control. It can be very uncomfortable because all of a sudden you're going from no external inputs to 4K Technicolor rainbow inputs, and that can be hard to deal with. It is especially hard to deal with if you do not have access to your own akasha and non-dual light, because access to your own akasha and non-dual light gives you the ability to make the entities that are speaking to you and making that sound in your ear go away. The next method by which this typically happens involves ritual. Okay, there are various ritual systems out there that will grant you or give you access to your own clairvoyance and clairaudience. Typically, this involves some kind of mantra recitation, and again, you're going to have the issue of spirit magic and the accompanying egregore engaging an influence over you as long as you use that method. Now, some of these systems result in the ability coming on slowly. Some of them result in the ability coming on quickly. And again, the kind of clairvoyance or clairaudience in this case that you get is going to tend to track along a very specific level based upon that ritual system. Okay, now we get to the category of actually training for this. Okay, what does training look like when you're training clairaudience? Okay, the first level of this involves different chi circulation exercises. It involves moving energy in and out of the ears of different kinds to develop an appropriate flavor of clairaudience. These exercises tend to take a lot of work. It also has a lot to do with your genetic predisposition for developing clairaudience in the first place. Just like with athletics or any other thing that involves expression via the human body, some people are simply far more gifted at this genetically than others. One thing that I have seen over the years is that people with very strong transmission ability tend to not have very good clairvoyance or clairaudience. Interestingly enough, they tend to have very good clairsentience. Go figure. However, these exercises take a lot of time. Also, the kind of clairaudience they develop has a lot to do with what kind of energy is trained. So if you train with a lot of Akasha through those sense gates, you're going to get Akashic level information. Mental energy, vital energy, elemental energies, same kind of deal. So you can easily see a scenario where if you want to talk to elementals from all the elemental realms, fire, air, water, earth, you may have to complete all of the clairaudient exercises several times, one with each of the elements. It really just depends upon how clearly you want that transmission to be. Okay, what are other things involved in clairaudient training? Well, this is where things like spagyrics, things like charged fluids become very helpful. In fact, Franz Barden describes how to make one for clairaudience using chamomile tea in his book Initiation into Hermetics. This seems to be fairly common. Now, these and the yogic exercises seem or appear to be addressing the clairaudient issue involving the mechanical aspect of the body, the pipes, basically. And that's most of what you're going to see that's easily explained. However, luckily for the rest of us, there is another way to access clairaudience. And it works best in conjunction with the yogic training I just talked about. But depending upon how well put together it is, you may or may not need it. Okay, this is to use an approach that condenses that subtle sound into something more physical or more terrestrial. Okay, one of the most common ways to do this is, of course, known as the crystal method in evocation, where you use a quartz crystal or another similar stone, and through engaging the proper yogic and evocation exercises, the entity can actually make the stone vibrate in a way where it generates sound that can either be heard with the naked ear or with a very low level of clairaudient development. The nice thing about this method is when you're not using the stone, you don't hear the entity. The downside to using this method is, unless you use the stone, you can't hear the entity. There are other similar related methods involving a glass of water or charged fluid, so on and so on. In Franz Barton's Kabbalah, there is the letter W. The letter W essentially condenses that subtle sound of the entity that's trying to speak onto a lower level of reality, so it makes it easier to hear the entity. There are also some things out there known as spirit boxes and other pieces of technology that seem to be performing a somewhat similar function. So that's an introduction to clairaudience and why you would want to train it. Again, if you want to engage with the spirit world with any degree of fidelity, having some degree of clairaudience is definitely helpful. Otherwise, you can see the entity, might even be able to touch the entity to a limited degree, but you can't communicate. So, if you like the topic of today's discussion, give us a like and consider subscribing to the channel. And if you'd like to learn more about all of this, go check out the details box below, where you can get into contact with 60skills.com and learn about all we do. Otherwise, as per usual, train hard and be well.